I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to talk today. I'm David Frayne. I'm a sociologist from the UK, and today I'm representing a body of ideas, sometimes called the critique of work, or post-work, or even anti-work. But no matter what we call these ideas, their main aim is to try and scrutinise what we might call the employment-based society. So imagine you've been invited to a party and you don't know many people there, and a stranger comes up to you and asks your name, and then immediately follows up by asking, "What do you do?" And without any further prompting, you know that this person wants you to volunteer information about your job, your paid work. And if your job is prestigious, then you might relish the question. But if you're unemployed, on the other hand, then you might have been fearing this question, and you might feel a sense of shame, or at least a need to account for yourself. And this familiar pattern of interactions is the way it is because we live in an employment-based society, a society that revolves in many different senses around the activity of paid work. And this system has a number of dimensions to it. The first dimension is that employment is connected to our ability to meet material needs. In a capitalist system, jobs are the main way that production is organised, and the main mechanism for socially distributing income. The convention is you work to earn to buy the things you need. But we also know that jobs mean much more than this because they also have a deep cultural significance. Work, as we've said, is a means of identification. And working is also associated with virtue. It's seen as an expression of civic duty. Working a job is supposed to be what elevates us above a kind of reprehensible dependency on the state. To be a non-worker, even if you're disabled or have caring responsibilities, is to risk being seen as a bad citizen. And we see a lot of stigmatizing language around this, around being unproductive or a scrounger or a welfare queen or a drain on society. This stereotype of sleeping on the sofa waiting for the benefit check to arrive. So jobs are connected to virtue. And a final feature of the employment-based society is that jobs are perceived as the main stage for public life. So where I am in the UK, major public health organisations are in agreement that employment is what gives people the structure, the social contact, and the sense of purpose that keeps us healthy. The prospect of flourishing without employment, either now or in a different kind of society in the future, is not really entertained. And this slide shows a diagram that features prominently in a UK government paper entitled Improving Lives. And this is a paper which signals plans to reform the public healthcare system around the idea that jobs are good for people. So there are proposals to place job coaches in hospitals, to assess the effectiveness of health services based on whether they get people working. The main form of psychotherapy available in the UK Health Service is now explicitly directed towards getting mentally distressed people into a job. Over the past few decades, welfare systems have also been seen increasingly not as a support system, but as an apparatus for getting unemployed people back into a job. And depending on the country you live in, this will be accomplished through some combination of encouragement and punishment. In the UK, things are skewed more towards punishment. Claimants of unemployment benefits have been obliged to agree to apply for X number of jobs, to attend psychological interventions to make them more employable and adopt a more positive attitude about employment. And have even been coerced into working for free under the cover of work experience. And failing to comply with these guidelines can result in having benefits suspended or cut off. And the UK was actually recently the subject of a UN human rights investigation, partly because of its extension of these practices to disabled people. The UN rapporteur Philip Alston says The government has made no secret of its determination to place major limits on government support and to pursue a single-minded focus on getting people into employment at all costs. So that's the employment-based society in summary. Jobs are the core from which most major goods are supposed to flow, whether it's an income, access to healthcare, or the opportunity to gain respect and cooperate with others. Having a job means being able to put food on the table, but it also means having a public life and a place in society. I found it helpful to refer to this situation with the shorthand, the word dogma, a kind of reluctance on the part of policymakers, educators, scholars, whomever, to think outside an idea of progress based on maximising employment. And the critical perspective that I've been endorsing during the past decade or so tries to challenge this. The Marxist feminist author Kathy Weeks describes the need to denaturalise our employment-based system. If this system is something that we've been socialised into and take for granted, the idea is to take a kind of imaginative step back. Weeks writes, "The fact that at present one must work to earn a living is taken as part of a natural order rather than a social convention. Consequently, we tend to focus on the problems with this or that job, or on the absence of work, but rarely do people question work as a requirement, work as a system, work as a way of life." So in the spirit of Kathy Weeks, we can talk about an intellectual refusal of work, which is about developing an idea of social progress based on something else. The possibility of reducing the amount of time people are obliged to spend in employment, or expanding opportunities for people to be able to have an interlude, or exit the labour force and still be able to meet their needs. And so that's what I think of when I think of post-work ideas. It's thinking critically about not only what happens within particular jobs, but about the functions of employment as an institution in society as a whole. And what I'd like to argue in the rest of this lecture is that these kinds of approaches are especially relevant right now in response to the coronavirus pandemic. As we're well aware, mitigating the pandemic has meant suspending huge parts of the economy. Millions of people have been cast into redundancy or faced drastic cuts to their hours and pay. Welfare systems and food banks have been overwhelmed. In some US cities, the unemployment rate has reached the Great Depression levels of 20%. And in the UK, it's predicted that a second spike in coronavirus cases would correspond to an unemployment rate of around 15%. And in an employment-based system, where a whole range of fundamental goods are supposed to flow from jobs, this is unmistakably a crisis. But crucially, I think this is also a moment to remember that the job society was in crisis well before the pandemic. In 2017, around 11% of Americans were not earning enough to take them over the poverty line. Economists and sociologists were using the term precarity, a situation in which factors like globalization, deregulation, and automation have diminished work as a source of security. This is a world of stagnating wages, a loss of employment benefits, insecure employment contracts. Headlines like this one were common even before the pandemic. The Uber drivers of San Francisco sleeping in parking lots in order to make a living. The crisis also has a subjective dimension. For all the educational and cultural emphasis on jobs as a means to contribute and achieve meaning and shape identity and so on, employment for many people is tremendously unfulfilling. At the broadest level, this is because work under capitalism mainly exists to generate profits and is therefore driven by maxims that tend to undermine it as a source of fulfillment. So priorities like efficiency, calculability, standardization, this is what we call the treadmill, the 9-to-5, the daily grind. And a lot of this intensification of work has been propped up by new digital technologies. So we've seen call center software that automatically connects calls to a headset, that records workers' productivity and performance, that automatically reports workers for being away from their desks. We've also seen the infamous handheld trackers at Amazon warehouses, handheld machines which control every aspect of the workers' movements. In her recent book, On the Clock, Emily Grendelsberger reported on her experiences in 3 of the biggest low-wage sectors: fast food service, a call center, and an Amazon warehouse. And after weeks of optimizing, multitasking, and being humiliated by customers, she had this to say: nearly everyone with influence in the US is incredibly insulated from how miserable and dehumanizing the daily experience of work has got over the past decade. So there's this tremendous rift between the idealization of jobs as a source of meaning and identity and the actual realities of work for huge numbers of people. And this degree of alienation is not strictly necessary because capitalism contains within it the potential for a massive reduction in the amount of time spent in employment. The history of capitalism is a history of innovations in automation technology, workflows, divisions of labour. It's a history in which productivity has grown exponentially, and which, by previous forecasts, we should all be enjoying a heck of a lot more free time as a result. But this potential of capitalist development hasn't been unlocked. And this is because under capitalism, the official purpose of innovations in automation and so on is not actually to expand the realm of free time. These innovations are directed to benefit economic interests, to increase profits, to reduce labour costs, to limit capital's dependence on flesh and bone workers who get sick and protest and assert their rights and create all kinds of friction in the labour process. The problem is summarised neatly in this essay by Bertrand Russell in praise of idleness. Russell says, "Modern methods of production have given us the possibility of ease and security for all. We've chosen instead to have overwork for some and starvation for others, continuing to be as energetic as we were before there were machines." So like many thinkers, including Marx, John Maynard Keynes, Andre Gortz, and others, Russell pointed to this tremendous wastage of capitalism's productive powers. It's failed to substantially alleviate the need to perform necessary work. So what I'm trying to do here is just to provide some context. Jobs have been degraded as a source of security and meaning, and we also have this latent potential to give citizens more free time, which hasn't been realized. And this all comprises what we think of as normal. And if we think about the coronavirus pandemic, within this context, we might want to question the idea that the number one priority is to now return to normal. What if this were an opportune moment to instead focus on a different set of ideas? And here I will briefly talk about 2 ideas, and both of these ideas are kind of staples in the tradition of post-work thinking. First is the proposal to decouple jobs from income with universal welfare provision. And second is the proposal to decouple jobs from the entitlement to recognition with a revision of the work ethic. So one of the questions thrown up by the pandemic is the question of how governments are going to guarantee citizen security in a future of potentially limited employment. One common proposal is to detach jobs from the right to survival with a policy of universal basic income, often called UBI, which is a regular state payment issued to everybody as a right of citizenship. And a key benefit of UBI in a time of emergency is that it installs a guaranteed minimum income. Another benefit is that it can be delivered efficiently without the wait times and bureaucracy of means testing. And making it universal also guarantees that nobody who needs support will be excluded. Now, this may mean that the money ends up in the hands of people who don't need it, although, as advocates have argued, there's no reason why this couldn't be reclaimed by increasing taxes on the wealthy. Now, depending on the size of UBI payments, it could protect the population against fluctuations in labour demand, or it could do more than this. It could give workers more bargaining power at work, or the ability to exit jobs and family situations which are oppressive without the risk of destitution. One current debate in this area surrounds the question of whether guarantees for services, things like education, healthcare, transport, housing, whether these would have greater public benefits than UBI. During the current pandemic, the necessity of universal healthcare, for example, has never been clearer, and it's almost certainly the case that some combination of basic income and services is the most defensible. But no matter how the public is provisioned, the pandemic has made it impossible to ignore what was already apparent, that a society where survival is tied to the ability to perform paid work is a profoundly insecure society. Another enticing aspect of basic income is that instead of unemployment being experienced as a kind of dead time, a time of poverty and exclusion, it could be a space where people have the resources to do something they find worthwhile. People could find time for playing and doing activities that are conventionally unpaid, such as care work and volunteer work and creative work. As societies face the prospect of mass unemployment, it will be important to have faith in the capacity of jobless people to lead a socially connected existence. Now, the pandemic might have done little to stimulate the imagination in this regard, because experiences of social isolation during the lockdown risk reinforcing the conservative idea that the only choice is between employment and doing nothing. And part of what post-work ideas are about is trying to envisage a third option between employment and isolation. Thinkers have been asking what new kinds of spaces and infrastructures could support activities outside the remit of the market. Can we imagine, for example, a different kind of city where there are abundant spaces for people to collaborate and build and learn and care and play? 20 years ago, in a book called Reclaiming Work, Andre Gortz visualized a culture-oriented city with a profusion of day nurseries, parks, meeting places, sports grounds, gyms, workshops, music rooms, theatres and libraries. And from the vantage of this new culture-based city, is it possible that jobs would no longer seem so indispensable as a source of social contact and belonging? In the time of coronavirus, we've actually seen lots of examples of spontaneous production and organizing outside the scope of jobs. Volunteer drivers have created community fleets for key workers. Students have organized to babysit the children of healthcare workers. People are delivering supplies to vulnerable neighbors. And people experiencing this kind of self-organization for the first time may very well be thinking what else they could accomplish with that energy. And a form of politics that was interested in more than just the rate of employment would focus on how to support these kinds of activities. So moving on, if the economic shock of the pandemic points to a need to decouple jobs from the right to survival, it also demands a revision of the value systems that surround employment. This is a really prime moment to talk about disconnecting work from the national sense of what makes a valued citizen, to get rid of the glorification of jobs as a source of dignity, to get rid of the stigma that labels welfare claimants as disgraceful and dependent and so on. This value system was offensive to non-working people before the pandemic, but it's starting to feel particularly outdated now given the new heights that unemployment has reached. The idea that people in poverty are struggling because they make poor choices or have a defective work ethic, for example, has really come under strain. The philosopher Michael Cholby has argued that the idea of a general civic obligation to take part in employment has actually been problematic for some time. The idea of a general duty to work rests on an idea of reciprocity, or what Cholby terms the fair play argument. The idea that any individual who benefits from the social product generated by market activities has an equal obligation to contribute to that product by working a job. The idea that you should not take from society without giving something in return. And that's an idea that seems to make a good kind of moral sense. But Cholby suggests that it rests on conditions that have completely fallen apart. First of all, the returns that people receive on their labour are often inadequate. A combination of low wages and high living costs means that working people are often still unable to satisfy their basic needs. So the returns on labour often aren't fair. And also, people don't share equal opportunities to contribute something of value to the collective good through employment. Partly because there aren't enough jobs to go around. The demand for labour fluctuates over time, and at certain points not everybody is needed to work. And partly because a lot of the jobs which are available serve dubious purposes. So we know that whole sections of the economy, for example, are clustered around the production of goods that are fairly worthless by most definitions. These goods have to be manufactured, distributed, advertised, disposed of. Many workers will actually readily admit that their jobs are pointless. One study using 2015 data surveyed workers from 37 countries and found that 17% of people doubt that their work contributes anything of value to society. David Graeber, an anthropologist, has called this the phenomenon of bullshit jobs. He gathered a bunch of testimonies and he showed us the lives of workers who were hired just to make supervisors look good, to manipulate consumers, to correct the same error over and over again, to collect data that nobody uses, or supervise workers who'd be just fine regulating themselves. And in the context of the pandemic, if Graeber is correct, when social distancing is completely over, we shouldn't be surprised to discover that the stoppage of some sections of the economy has really had little social impact. What we've learned, if anything, is that it's typically the undervalued jobs that have turned out to be key. Stocking shelves, logistics work. The pandemic has also reminded us is that a lot of the most socially valuable work happens outside the remit of a paid job. It's the care we provide to children and friends and neighbours. And it's a fairly arbitrary system of values that says these forms of unpaid work are somehow less of a social contribution than working a job. So what we might now hope to see is a shift in the value systems that surround employment, a decoupling of employment from the right to recognition and the national sense of what makes a good citizen. So I want to try and draw this to a conclusion. What I would argue is that when many leaders are calling for a rapid return to normal, the economic shock of COVID-19 could instead be seen as a moment to move forward into something new. That instead of clinging to the old goals of job creation and maximizing employment, we ought to also consider a form of politics that supports people to live with security and dignity and to do something worthwhile without a lifelong job. I think of post-work as ultimately an imaginative exercise that tries to hold on to the idea that the future is still an open possibility. It says maybe we can envisage a system where jobs are no longer the centerpiece from which all goods flow, a world beyond the employment-based society. The idea is to shift the question I talked about at the beginning, what do you do, to a new question of what would you do? What would you do if employment were no longer a condition of survival and social acceptance? What would you do if you had more free time? Those are the questions I'll leave you with. Thanks very much for listening. And to play us out, here's a clip of one of the best post-work authors, Kathy Weeks.
that part of what I'm interested in too with these sort of utopian demands of less work and a guaranteed basic income is the way that they help us sort of think more critically about the relationship between work and the rest of life, but also more imaginatively about the possibilities of a life that's not so relentlessly subordinated to work. What would I do if I had more non-work time? What would my relationship to my work be if the economic necessity to work was alleviated just a bit? You know, if the link between work and income was sort of loosened a bit. And I think it opens up all these possibilities for thinking about living differently. I mean, who has time to do anything between work and family? So I also want to sort of open up the possibilities for, again, what we will. You know, what would we do? And does it make us anxious? If so, why? That in itself is interesting. So I really think that these demands are really generative, not just of needed reforms that would help people live their lives, but also generative of critical perspectives and of the political imagination. And we have so few opportunities to exercise our political imagination. So I also want the demands to do that for us, and the practice of demanding to enable us collectively to do some of that thinking and imagining.